Well, as you're waiting just for another minute or so, I was curious if you had seen the recent conversation between Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins.
I've seen various conversations. I haven't seen that one, I don't think. If it was recent, I probably missed it. Was it interesting?
It was somewhat interesting, and as I've been sitting in this class, I'm wondering if there's any similarities between Peterson's view and Wittgenstein's view. Um, but they were talking past each other, unfortunately. And so I don't know how familiar you are with Peterson's approach to ancient texts or religion or stories, but Peterson would express a view, and then Richard Dawkins would basically say, well, I'm not so much interested in the symbols, I'm interested in the facts. And so there was a lot of talking past each other.
I can imagine there would be. I will say this about Peterson, though. I suspect he would be more interested in the benefits, the advantages and disadvantages of belief. He tends to be, he's not a huge fan of critical theory, but I think he does like the idea of structures that support living, if that makes sense. So there's this kind of quid pro quo. But my argument would be that if you're religious, your grounds for belief in God can't be based on it's good for me. I had that I've made this point previously that a student who said, I think there are better health outcomes for people who believe in God. And it's like, great, that's what's wonderful, but irrelevant, because that's not a reason for. It's like, would I listen to music more if it was better for me? Maybe, but religious belief, that seems just a little bit off. But so I don't know if Peterson would make that claim. I suspect there'd be a sort of lurking shadow of it more so. And it's hard to set down that scientist mentality, because I think in certain respects they're not talking completely past each other, not quite in the same way that Richard Dawkins would talk straight past, well, me probably, but also devout religious believers themselves. He does have a tendency to talk straight past people.
Hmm.
But were you aligning yourself more with Peterson?
I'm not quite sure what I think of Peterson yet. And I do think that he is interested in the utility of some of the beliefs, but I'm now coming to see that he may be less interested just in the utility as he is in the inescapability of different, I think, religious approaches. And he's saying you can't escape. Even Dawkins cannot escape these religious ideas. They just are not aware of their religious ideas.
Yeah, and I think that's not quite. You're absolutely right to separate that from the utility argument, but it isn't a million miles away from that utility argument either, because again, what you have to do, you have to do. It's still not it's not quid pro quo, but it is, you have to do this anyway. He has similar points around critical theory on, for instance, if you get rid of one hierarchy, you're just going to have another. We need to release serotonin through our systems. Lobsters do the same thing. We will do the same thing. There's no way to avoid this, although I would argue back at that. But one of the systems that we have for releasing serotonin is trying to change the society in which we live. It makes us feel good to change the society in which we live. So it can hardly be anti-critical theory. Critical theory in its original intent was just research to change society. We just want to make things better. That's what research is for. And maybe on that definition, he wouldn't be opposed to it. But I suppose maybe he would be opposed to this idea that there's a perfect way for us to be. And I agree with him on that. That's less plausible. A little bit like there's a perfect form of life. There's the correct way to live. There's your way of living, and correctness will be determined by that. It can't possibly be determined out of that. And so I suppose maybe you might say that, yes, these views are starting to align. And I think as well, because next week we're going to be talking more about these contemporary debates. We'll bring in Dawkins. We'll absolutely have time to mention this as well. And then of course we can bring it back in the final discussion as well, because I suspect those are the things that are going to be most relevant to people and grabbing people most from the discussion we're having. I suspect people will think, okay, yeah, but what does it mean for us now? How do we actually implement this?
Nice.
Okay.
Yeah, I like it.
Thanks, Aaron. No, great question though, and I will look it up. I will look it up. Um, let's get the screen shared. I hope that I'll be able to see people coming in because that's going to be the bigger problem. Okay, so that should now just broadcast my screen to everyone. And then if I bring up that, can you see that okay?
Yeah, that's coming through. It's full screen.
Excellent. Okay. And I can see you, Aaron, and only you, um, which means I suspect it's because you were the last person to speak. So if anyone wants to ask a question, please do unmute and ask the question. But if you could stay muted for now, just so that if there's background noise, you don't pop up. Because if I see you pop up, I might think you want to ask a question. Again, I may not be able to manage this as well as normal, but we'll see how this goes. Um, Okay. We still have dwindling numbers. This is, I don't know if this should be concerning to me or if it's just because it's a bad week. But hopefully it's not a sign of things to come, but also it's possibly because some people are enjoying the recordings as well. So I'm glad that we're recording this because everyone who has previously signed up to review the course will be able to get this recording as well. So welcome to those who couldn't make it as well. So in this session, we're going to be talking about a particular objection to Wittgenstein's philosophy, one that has had staying power, so much so that this entire book was written about it. The two philosophers on the front cover you can see there are D.Z. Phillips on the left, who I knew very well. He was my professor in Swansea. He used to spend half his time in Swansea and half his time in California. So if you could see this photo in color, you would see just how well tanned he was. As I said last week, I think he's the best tanned, well, he was the best tanned Welshman you would ever see. And on the right of the screen, on the right of the photo, is Kai Nielsen. So both are Wittgensteinians, but Kai Nielsen is very much taking the line that Wittgenstein should not be used to defend religion in particular. So he endorses a Wittgensteinian approach, but thinks that it's not the appropriate way of arguing for or against religion, that actually the whole methodology is unsound. This is an argument against a methodology. That's probably the best way to put this. They're not arguing against specific claims. They're saying Wittgenstein's philosophy kills debate and it ends rational engagement with questions in a reasonable way. We'll talk about why that is. But interestingly, if you pick up this book, and there is absolutely no need to do so, this is a very in-depth debate between two philosophers who are arguing about this tiny amount of disagreement between them. It's often the way. There was a debate between McDowell and Dreyfus, I remember, about a decade ago, and that debate was over the use of the word grasp and whether grasping meant that you had conceptual knowledge of something before you saw it or after you saw it. But it was instantaneously before or instantaneously after. And that's how much they were arguing about. So these kinds of debates might be relevant to philosophers, but ultimately it led nowhere. As you can tell, the question here, the title of the book here is Wittgensteinian Fideism question mark. So just like religious point of view, once again, we have a book titled with a question mark because is it even a thing? Kai Nielsen accused D.Z. Phillips of being a fideist. D.Z. Phillips denied being a fideist. And this went on for an entire book, paper after paper after paper, exchanged between them saying, yes, you are, no, you're not. Yes, you are, and they go, no, you're not. And it felt very much like two 5-year-olds arguing over whether or not one of them smells. So it's very much an argument, I think, largely based on innuendo, but there is a substantial point to be drawn out here. And I think it relates more to our bigger question, the question that we've had in the background of our discussions all the way along, which is Wittgenstein really defending religion? Or is there something else going? Is this a philosophical method? Is this an approach to understanding human lives in general, whether we were religious or not religious? What's going on here? But the underlying argument here is that by developing an argument that essentially immunizes religion from criticism, that you are also pocketing it away. You're turning it into something which only has rules by its own lights and has no impact on our lives and on our other aspects of our lives. And the other aspects of our lives, like science, for instance, can't have an impact on it. Which D.Z. Phillips, just to be clear, I'll say this right now, Fundamentally denied. He said, how can you possibly argue that science has had no influence on religion and that religion has had no influence on science? It's absurd to make that claim. Copernicus's discovery, Darwin's discovery, Freud's discoveries, if these are scientific discoveries, these are clearly having an impact on theology, not least because Darwin was studying divinity at the time. He was specifically writing his theory in response to William Paley's design theory about how things get created because God designs them for their functions. And Darwin was arguing, no, 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 the world designs them. So that whole debate is a debate centered around a question which they both share. But Wittgensteinians do want to argue that religion and science can't be weighed against the rules entirely according to another game. What that means is you can weigh up whether you prefer badminton or football, but you can't judge a play in badminton according to the rules of football. That's the point that's being made here. So there is this separation of them, but there is also this closeness. And I think, in a way, DZ Phillips welcomed this debate because articulating precisely how religion and science interact, how the games that we play, our different forms of life, interact with each other, was of central interest to him. It was really, really important for DZ Phillips to get clear on that question. And maybe Kai Nelson's right to say that there isn't a lot of clarity there. But I must confess my bias towards DZ Phillips. I'm a Wittgensteinian philosopher of religion. I think Wittgenstein is very relevant to these conversations, and I do defend Phillips's view, but I absolutely welcome criticism. So as we go through, let's genuinely weigh up these disagreements. Okay. So what is fideism? Well, the first word that comes to my mind when I think of fideism is fidelity, the idea of staying true to something, right? So high fidelity, hi-fi speakers, they have high fidelity if they stay true to the source music, if there's not a lot of interference from other things. So the idea here is it's the removal of interference from outside of the form itself. So what the point being that fideism and fidelity mean staying true to something. So interestingly, it's treated as a pejorative term, meaning it's treated as an insult in philosophy. If you call someone a fideist, that's a negative thing to be. I'm not entirely sure why, because I don't know why DZ Phillips couldn't say, yes, I'm a fideist, but I'm not a strict fideist. I'm not someone who thinks that religion has nothing to do with science and science has nothing to do with religion, that you can't put the two things together. That's obviously absurd. But he could have said, I'm a fideist insofar as I think that you can't judge one entirely by the rules of the other. That I'll accept. But, so the idea of fidelity actually is a generally good thing in music. Perhaps it's a good thing in forms of life as well. Perhaps we want there to be this element of fidelity to how we engage in understanding different forms of life, different language games, as Wittgenstein would call them. But there is also this other charge that gets associated with this, another negative term. And the reason I've put the two together is because hi-fi and quietism. So the idea of speakers and music playing sound, staying true to themselves through fidelity, but also this idea of quietism, because the argument that Wittgenstein is developing, a fideism, is the argument that essentially what he's saying is you can't judge this form of life according to any other form of life. Someone can't step in from outside and say you're doing this wrong. You can only understand it from inside the form of life or within the game. So Wittgenstein gets accused of quietism because it looks to people from the outside, again, that they're being told you can't be part of this, get out, stop talking about it. And it looks like quietism is the charge that you're silencing others. You're bringing their disagreements and objections to a close without ever hearing them, essentially. So it's silencing other people, quietist approaches. Again, this isn't just linked to Wittgenstein. It isn't even just linked to this debate. There's lots of arguments about quietism that go on in philosophy where they say that's a quietist position, meaning it establishes a nice, safe, quiet, refuge for people who want to hold the belief, which means that they don't have to hear any noise. It's very much like the bubble that we talk about today, the kind of social media bubble. But this is one where it's quiet within our particular bubble. We don't have to hear anything that sort of jars or upsets us. So Wittgenstein seems to be setting up this situation where he says, quieten down any criticism, just accept things the way they are. That seems to be the kind of view, almost like a stoic, someone who is quieting down debate. So as I say, this idea that Wittgenstein is saying, shh, don't criticize things, implies a kind of stifling of the debate and a rejection of any kind of criticism out of hand. And Wittgenstein is accused of this on the grounds that he's immunizing religion from criticism rather than actually offering a defense. As we'll see in a moment, Wittgenstein is going to say there is no need for a defense. And this is what they think means, oh, you're saying it's fine the way it is. But again, saying it's fine would call for a defense. What he's arguing for is it's a fact. Similar to what Aaron was just saying about Jordan Peterson's approach. Jordan Peterson is saying these are facts of our nature. You can't alter them. You can't improve on them. You can't make them. Note it again, similar to, I can see why Aaron sees this connection with Jordan Peterson, because there's this element of everything's fine, everything stays the way it is. Even you can be angry about it, but your anger is also just a fact of human nature that you can't escape from. That's closer to what Wittgenstein is arguing. But what it looks like to other people is you're saying, you can't talk about this. I'm just going to quickly jump back into Zoom a second and just make sure I haven't got any other people waiting to get in. No, good. Okay. Is that back and working okay? Can everyone see the slides?
Yep, that looks great.
Right. Oh, thank you, Aaron. Cheers. So last week, we saw a sort of an example of this with Wittgenstein saying that magical beliefs can be performative. You can burn in effigy without having to think that that leads on to another outcome. Or as a way of protecting myself from harm, I can sort of do this magical dance, or I can cross my fingers. It becomes very superstitious. Basically, I'm doing this in order to see a result. And what Wittgenstein is going to say that no, some beliefs are performative. They are just ritualistic. They're celebrations. That's what they are. There are also people who do cross their fingers to avoid harm. I'm one of them, by the way. I also say touch wood. My brother, when he sees a magpie, I've mentioned this before, sees a lone magpie, he will spit and salute. Not spit in the car. He's driving along, he'll just mock spit. But anyway, he'll salute. But the point is, he's got this kind of ritualistic behavior because he's worried, oh, if I don't do that, then something bad will happen. Or at least that's how he would explain it to someone else. What Wittgenstein might say is, no, this is a way of connecting yourself with reality. Even if that's not a celebration, that can be meaningful in and of itself. But the move there is to say, oh, is that true of all rituals then? Are you saying that this is an interpretation of all rituals, that they are performative or celebratory? No, but almost all of them could be open to that interpretation. But that's not to say that people don't also do things specifically to see a result. And those are also fine, by the way. We're leaving those as they are as well. The point is, though, they're different from the other kind. Singing happy birthday to make someone older would be a fundamentally different thing from singing happy birthday to celebrate someone's birthday. But both behaviors could exist. They could exist. It just happens to be that actually one of them doesn't right now. But equally, you can start to blur the lines where you have people using dowsing rods to find water, which looks very much like I'm doing this in order to find water, and people who have a kind of dowsing rod, which is a symbol of the person who finds water. They hold it up almost like a staff or like a stick. They're kind of championed out as being the person, the water finder, that kind of thing. So, but again, it could be that all water finders now are using dowsing rods in order to find water. They think that they are a magical tool for finding water. It could be that people think that that's what dowsing rods are for. And I have a colleague who works closely with people in Spain who do this. They use dowsing rods to find water. They've done it for hundreds of years. But the question is this: when they started it 800 years ago, was it different to what it is now? And is it changed because science has led us on to thinking only in terms of, if I do this, then I see this? There's a lot of this kind of background noise of science where we think the only reason for doing anything is to see a causal effect afterwards. Um, in the lecture on ethics, Wittgenstein says, and I think I've mentioned this already, that we have lost our ability to see a miracle. That if my head was to turn into that of a lion and then turn back into a human head, most people would react by saying, how did that happen? Was that an app on his Zoom? Was that something that, was that a filter that he used then? Or was that some sort of hallucinogenic that I was taking? Can everyone see that his head just turned into that of a lion? Or am I the only one who can see it? So there's this kind of, we immediately start thinking in causal terms. Remember the statues. If we see a statue, we immediately think either God made it happen or the priest made it happen. We don't think it's miraculous. Why shouldn't the Virgin Mary weep for the sins of the world? Just see it as a miracle, to take it on board as a religious occurrence rather than to try and explain or offer a justification for it. And Wittgenstein says we're very heavily pulled in one direction. Lovely example he uses is he says, in the past, we might have looked at an apple tree blowing in the wind and said, look at the leaves, they're dancing. But he says, now we're inclined to say, if only I knew the velocity of the wind and the elasticity of the leaves, I could predict exactly how those leaves would move. And his point is, they don't contradict each other. You could easily go back to saying the leaves are dancing. But because we can think in terms of velocity of winds and elasticity of leaves, we're going to think in those terms as well. And it's just, you don't do both. But I said, I likened it to the introduction of showers, meaning we take fewer baths. But showers don't contradict baths. There's nothing logically contradictory going on here. There's just, if you take baths, you aren't also taking a shower. It's one or the other. So the existence of one precludes the existence of the other, but not because they contradict each other. So again, rituals can be performative. They can also be superstitious. Which one it is for us to look and see. But if we think, we're inevitably going to take it the causal route because our thinking is always so causal. We're going to think that it's a superstition because, like us, they're trying to explain it. They're trying to explain something, trying to bring something about. And again, so Wittgenstein, I would argue, is not offering this sort of blanket support for all games, all ritualistic practices. He's saying, I'm describing what these different practices are capable of. These ones over here look performative to me. These ones over here look superstitious to me. That's all he's doing. He's putting them into sort bags, into different sets. He's still an analytic philosopher after all. So he's thinking very much in these kind of conceptual terms of put one over here and one over here, one over here. But it's foolish to say they must exist all in one category or the other. And so I would argue Wittgenstein is less a quietist and more, kind of this vocalist who's trying to get everyone to speak. I'll come on to that in a bit. So Wittgenstein, in a book called On Certainty, and this might strike you as strange because in a way he seems to be saying nothing is certain. But what he is saying is the nature of certainty is that you don't question something. So there's a difference between, for instance, not being sure that your grandfather is your grandfather, right? Because my grandmother told me so, or whatever. By the way, the reason I bring that up is because I have hair. My grandfather didn't. My mother's father did not have hair. By the age of 21, he was bald. And allegedly, you're supposed to get baldness genetically from your grandfather, from your maternal father, from maternal grandfather, sorry. So your mother's father is the person who's supposed to give you baldness. So the fact that I have hair might make my grandmother a liar. I don't know. I'm not going to make any accusations of her. My point is, I'm not certain. I could never be certain. I could never be 100% certain unless I travel back in time or something like that. Or you can't say, I'm absolutely certain that I'm related to Charlemagne. Almost everyone in the Western world is related to Charlemagne, allegedly. But I can't be certain of that unless I was to dig up Charlemagne's bones, maybe, and then even do a genetic test. And even then, that might not be certain because the genes might have come from some other source that just getting confused with Charlemagne's. My point, nonetheless, is Wittgenstein, however, would say you are absolutely certain that you didn't just travel to the moon and back. That you sitting there right now didn't, in the last 2 minutes, pop onto Mars, pop from here to the moon and come back again. And you don't even question that. That's not something you go, maybe I did and I just forgot, or maybe I did and I'm not so sure. No, this is something that is certain because it's beyond question. It's outside of the bounds of questioning. This is where most people live, by the way. Philosophers don't. This is why philosophers have to be reminded of this fact. because even in Wittgenstein's time, there was a philosopher called G.E. Moore, and Wittgenstein said some rather rude things about G.E. Moore. He said he shows how far you can get with limited intelligence. That was very mean. G.E. Moore, on the other hand, absolutely loved Wittgenstein. When he got a medal from the king, one of the highest awards anyone can get from the king, he came back and the first thing he said to his wife was, "Did you know the king hasn't heard of Wittgenstein?" So he was very admiring of Wittgenstein, but Wittgenstein less so of G.E. Moore. But G.E. Moore asked this question: "How do I know this is my hand?" And he goes, "Or how can I be certain there's an external world?" And he says, "Well, here's a hand, and here's another one." And his his argument does look very simplistic. It does look very childish. What he's saying is, if I deny the existence of this hand, first of all, I have to posit the existence of this hand. So the existence of this hand is simpler than its denial. Wittgenstein, however, just says, you don't doubt it. What would it mean to doubt that this hand in front of me is my hand? What would it mean to doubt that? You can create situations where you cross over someone's hand, you cover one up, and then you put a dummy hand in its place, and then you hit the dummy hand with a hammer, and the person there will go, ah! As if they've had their hand hit by a hammer, which of course they have not. So there are ways of tricking the brain into thinking something's your hand when it's not. But that's the aberration. That's the exception to the rule. The rule is I don't doubt this is my hand. I don't doubt that I'm speaking English. I don't doubt that my friend of 30 years is my friend as opposed to a robot who's been created to impersonate them. These are all things that are possible, but they're all things that I push out of the bounds of reality. This is what he talks about in Uncertainty. And so I think it's one of his most interesting texts, even though it was published posthumously and it's a collection of his notes. But he says in there, you must bear in mind that the language game is, so to say, something unpredictable. I mean, it is not based on grounds. It is not reasonable or unreasonable. It is there, like our life. His point is that language games exist. Period, full stop, done, that's it. There's no debating it. There's no questioning it, because to question it, like the hand, is to assume its existence. To say, oh, the language game of X doesn't exist. Well, you've just posited X. So clearly X does exist as a language game, even if it's just to deny its existence. And maybe you're right. Maybe it doesn't exist. For instance, I don't know anyone in Cambridge now who plays the game Eton Fives, which is essentially squash, but with your hand. You play it in a court, you knock the ball, you throw the ball, and you catch it, and so on. So Eton Fives is this game. Most of the Eton Fives courts in Cambridge, and they do still exist, are used to store furniture because there's hardly anyone playing them. But the game exists. Likewise, there are language games that we might have got rid of now. Like, for instance, there's a really interesting example where D.Z. Phillips was talking about these Mayan tribes who would kill their children. And people say, oh, they can't have loved their children. And D.Z. Phillips says, I think the harder thing is to imagine that they did, and they did it anyway. And that's a much harder thing to accept, but maybe that comes about through what he called the celebration of the terrible. That just breaks our brain, right? To think of celebrating the terrible just doesn't make sense to us, or at least doesn't make sense to me. I can't understand conceptually what it would mean to celebrate the terrible. But here's D.Z. Phillips saying, well, maybe they had that concept and we're now impoverished by lacking it. We can't have that concept anymore. We can't celebrate the terrible. Maybe some do. Nietzsche said, wish tragedy on your friends. Because his point is, if you haven't experienced tragedy in your life, then you've only experienced part of life. So to experience all of life, to have a full life, to have a complete life, you will have to experience tragedy. So shouldn't we want our friends to experience that? So in a way, Nietzsche is saying, wish tragedy on your friends, meaning celebrate the terrible. This is something that connects us with part of the world. I use the analogy, and I think I may have used this already. Apologies if I'm repeating myself, but the analogy of Queen Elizabeth II must have imagined that everywhere smelt of fresh paint, because every time she went anywhere, they'd already painted. So everywhere she goes smells of fresh paint. Well, if you would imagine that someone never experienced tragedy, then they're never going to experience the smell of something that isn't fresh paint. I mean, they'll never experience outside of that box, as it were. I don't think anyone does avoid tragedy altogether, but yeah, it's nonetheless a point that we can celebrate the terrible in the way that we can celebrate the rain. It's a fact, and we have to address it, and we can address it in this kind of uproarious, wondrous way. That possibility is not reasonable, and it's not unreasonable. It's just there. It's just something that we can do. And if we do it, if the deed is there, if the action is there, in again, I've mentioned this before, but Wittgenstein used to quote Goethe saying, "In the beginning was the deed." If the deed is there, if people do this, there's no denying its existence. But it's unpredictable. We don't know what people are capable of. A nice example of this is there's a tribe, I think it's an island just off the coast of Africa, where they can't talk to each other at night because they sign language to everyone. They only use sign language. So at night, with no electricity, they can't see each other. So they can't talk at night. And this fundamentally will change what your vocabulary will be. It will change your ability to talk to each other. But now I suspect they do have electricity. And now I suspect they have a completely different language. And now I also suspect they speak. So their whole world has changed because of how the language that they express, the games that they play within language. Now they can talk about the stars, they can talk about the moon. That's just a fundamentally different experience to having that as just something that is not to be talked about or can only be talked about during daytime. So shifting our languages, shifting our practices, this is what changes our life. So the fact that these practices exist mean if they change, our life changes. And I've always said, because I work in creativity, if you want to be truly creative, what you have to create are new practices, different deeds, things, people doing different things. That's what creativity is. Again, I'm just going to very quickly check, see if anyone's joining. No, okay. Okay. So I would argue Wittgenstein is less a quietist and more of a chorist, he's defending a kind of choral situation where lots of different voices can sing, lots of different practices can exist. If there's a life there to be lived in a particular way, he's just saying that's judgeable by its own existence. There isn't a single form of life that must be imposed upon all these other forms of life. Although you could argue, if they're singing in a choir, Alex, aren't they singing from the same hymn sheet? Aren't they singing from the same set of music? Wouldn't that be a set of? Maybe. Okay, perhaps. Maybe dissonant harmony might be a better way of putting it. Jazz might have been a better example. But the idea of there's a diversity of voices is my point, and they're all singing truth insofar as they're all singing perhaps different aspects of the music. But the point is that what's possible for human beings will find expression through someone or someone else, like the celebration of the terrible. It's not possible for me to express it, perhaps, but it's possible for others to express it in their form of life. I mentioned that Wittgenstein said, if a lion could speak, we would not understand him. And what he meant was even if it could speak English, because the form of life that a lion has is so fundamentally far removed from my form of life that I just wouldn't get what the references were. I suggested, for instance, and this one does make sense to me, which is why it's probably false. But imagine if a lion understands hunger in terms of distance. Well, if hunger is expressed in terms of distance, I won't know what that means. I can't have a common shared understanding of what that is. But of course, now imagine it even further removed, and that's probably how a lion is living their life. So and again, they don't have language, they don't have this form of life. But Wittgenstein is saying even if they could have this form of life, even if they could have language, their form of life would give it such different expression. They might use the same words, but we would have no idea how they were being used. I don't know how this word, what form of life this word has its use in. Imagine, for instance, someone from, I don't know, yeah, 6,000 years ago coming to today and hearing people talk about smartphones and apps and this kind of stuff. It's like, I know that's English, or even 200 years ago, and experiencing someone talking about smartphones. Like, I know what a phone is, and they're pretty smart, I guess. It's just to remove that form of life. And also, here's a good example, and this is a really interesting one. How do people get converted from one religion to another? If when colonial people traveled out to other places, parts of the world, some to Africa, to India, to Australia, to all over, to South America. How were they converting people to belief in Jesus Christ, a carpenter born 2,000 years ago in a place they've never heard of, who has certain miracles happen around them and by them, and this has some sort of relevance? No, of course not. You couldn't articulate that meaning to someone. Um, what you would probably do is say, let's build a church. What's a church? Doesn't matter. Let's build a church. Let's go there now. We've built it. We should go there every Sunday, and we should sing, and we should tell stories. And then slowly, what will happen is that a shared meaning, a shared form of life will take place. That's what will happen. And even perhaps given a new flavor, a new way of thinking, there'll be new things that will be introduced into that form of life that might track back to the origin. So it becomes a conversation, is my point. At one point, it is just people talking. At another point, it becomes people talking back, and it can become a conversation. There was a lovely example that one philosopher used where he said, when Dutch colonial people arrived in North America for the first time and they landed at Manhattan Island, what is now Manhattan Island, and they bought it from the indigenous people there. There was a con on both sides. The Danish, or the Dutch, sorry, the Dutch knew that it was worth more than they were paying for it. They didn't pay a handful of beads. There is a myth that it was a handful of beads. It wasn't. It was boxes of guns and furs and food and all sorts of things, but it wasn't worth what the island was worth. But on the other side of that agreement were some people who didn't have a concept of owning land. So what were they selling? They were essentially told, move over there to where there's all that other land. We'll have this bit of land and you move over there, but you get all of this stuff. And notice what happened there was we gave them our concept of property. We didn't take from them the concept of leasing the land from your children, which is arguably a shame. I don't know. I suspect that's probably a nicer concept. And the question then becomes, why did we give them our concept of property and not acquire their concept of leasing the land from their children? And the answer is probably, whilst we gave them guns, we had more of them. The Dutch, as in the Europeans, had more of them. So, of course, there was a kind of imbalance of power. And here we can get Marxist or critical theorist about it. We can talk about who had power and what. But the point is, for me, from a Wittgensteinian perspective, how does that exchange of language take place? And the answer is through persuasion. Wittgenstein says, at the end of reason comes persuasion. So underlying all this stuff is not rationality. There's no rational justification for being rational, for instance. There's no rational justification for the existence of property, for instance. One thing I learned in Political Philosophy 101, first question we ask is, should there be a state? Answer from almost everyone, no, there shouldn't be a state. And then we go into Political Philosophy 102 and we say, how should the state organize wealth? And we go, wait, hang on a second. Shouldn't we go back to the first question? Because I thought the answer was no. But the thing is, we live in a state. It exists. It's there, like our life. There's no getting away from it now. And I'm sure you wouldn't want to anyway. The existence of this Zoom call, for instance, the existence of Harbinger as an institute, the existence of Nashville Church of Christ, these things often rely on the existence of a state. There's no getting away from that reliance. I want a job. I want to be able to go to a supermarket and buy food. Why am I even saying this? I'm not defending the existence of the state. My point is, we've got one. And once you've got one, you then have to ask these secondary questions. But the primary question, notice, no one's justifying the state because it's not possible to do so. You can't justify something that basic in our lives and that something is just there. And again, you can't justify the use of language. Because to do so, you'd have to use language. And likewise, when I said you can't justify rationality, you can't give a rational justification for rationality because you'd have to use rationality to do so. And the whole point is where that would beg the question, as we say in philosophy. It would be to assume the conclusion in your argument. It would be to assume that rationality is good because you're using rationality to argue that rationality is good. Anyway, so Wittgenstein, I would argue, is giving voice to all of these different diverse ways of thinking. Because what he's saying to the critic is, you want there to be one unitary theory. You want there to be a theory that governs all of this, that says reason, period. Logic will work out everything afterwards. This is what so annoyed Russell. Russell said to Wittgenstein, you've made philosophy trivial. You're just talking about the things that do or don't exist. You're not talking about what's true and what's not true. And Wittgenstein just nodded and said, yeah, I'm making it trivial. It always was. It was never profound. Philosophy didn't create the reality in which it found itself. It was part of the reality in which it found itself. So philosophy has to accept those things that are facts too. And it is trivial, like anthropology is trivial. By the way, here's a piece of trivia for you. I have a heart. It's working is another piece of trivia. So again, these just because it's trivia, just because it's factual, doesn't remove its significance. On the contrary, its significance is given to it by me, by a perspective taken on those facts. As we were talking about before, the big book of facts would include Alex Carter has a heart, but it wouldn't include it's good that Alex Carter has a heart, and it wouldn't include I mean it metaphorically. It literally has a heart. So we could say that it's problematic to have these diversity of voices for another reason. We can go into that. Perhaps we'll talk more about that in the final session. But I will say it can't be called quietist. I've always found that a very odd accusation to level at Wittgensteinians, that you're quietist when you're saying, no. What I'm saying is you can't generalize. Maybe the general rule is diversity. Maybe difference is the commonality, is the common feature of things, that things differ from each other. That's not a general rule, though. That's just a recognition that there can't be general rules on some things. What if the exception was the case, as Wittgenstein says? What if difference was the case? What would you do then, philosophers? You want the world to make sense. What if it doesn't? What if ultimately, when you've boiled away all the things that do make sense, you're left with something that by definition can't make sense because you're left with it? It's the only thing that's left. As I said, the absurd, the frog in the bottom of the mug. What if you're just left with something that has form and shape, but cannot be explained away? And that's, I think, what Wittgenstein's getting at with it's there like our life. It's just the frog in the bottom of the mug. It's just the thing that defies explanation. You've explained everything away, but you can't explain why this thing still exists. And there's a lovely bit in the comedy show Futurama where Professor Farnsworth has become really depressed because he's solved all the problems of science. He's finally worked out what the world is made of. But then Fry, an idiot, says to the professor, but why is it this way and not another way? And the professor gets really excited because he's like, yes, finally, a question I can never answer. I can keep looking into that, but I can never answer why the universe is the way that it is as opposed to some other way. That's always going to be an open question, because whatever answer I come up with, why isn't it otherwise? So Wittgenstein is making this point that all language games are ultimately rooted in behaviors, and those behaviors are parts of a form of life that are just there, like our life. They're not to be explained. Explaining them would not do anything other than simply say, but why is it that way and not another way? You're just still left with the brute fact of our existence as this particular kind of strange being, this potentially psychotic ape, this rational animal, as Aristotle called us, or this kind of this quintessentially soulful creature, or whatever you want to call human beings. What we are is just what we are. There isn't getting away from that, and there's no attempt to explain beyond that. Explanations come to an end, and where they come to an end is usually with things that we do, the stuff that we explaining things. Very, very quickly, one lovely example is if you throw a stone. I think I may have mentioned this already. If you throw a stone, a toddler will see the stone clatter past them, and they'll look to where the stone came from. If you throw a toddler will immediately look to see where the stone came from. An AI, interestingly, does not. If you throw a stone in a computer game, the characters will run to the stone, as if looking at the stone will explain where it came from. Because, of course, in a computer world, if they saw where it came from, they'd know exactly where you were, because it's mathematical. So it would be just geometrical. They just say, oh, the stone came from over there. Literally the exact spot, the mathematical coordinates of the thrower is there. So, of course, it can't say, no one can tell an AI, you will infer the location of the thrower from the trajectory of the stone, because it knows it perfectly. So it'll instantly know exactly where you are. So, of course, they don't teach it that. So what you learn in computer games is computer characters don't behave like human beings. You throw a stone and they'll go to the stone, because that makes so much more sense in the computer world. But in this world, we just look for the cause. And looking for the cause is not behavior for which you can look for the cause, because you'd be exemplifying the very behavior of looking for the cause in doing so. But we don't only look for the cause, we can also not look for the cause. So the point is, these basic primitive as philosophers would call it, because there's nothing simpler, there's nothing behind them. These primitive reactions to things happening are just innate in what we do. And Wittgenstein says that religion is similar but different in one respect, because religion is telling you to behave in a certain way without justification. He puts it this way: religion says, do this, think like that, but it cannot justify this. And once it even tries to, it becomes repellent, because for every reason it offers, there is a valid counter reason. It is more convincing to say, think like this, however strangely it may strike you, or won't you do this, however repugnant you find it. So the point is, these are performative commands. These are what in philosophy we would call emotivist statements. They're telling you to act a certain way, to behave in a particular way. Feel the God's eye on you. Feeling God's eye on you, again, like I said, does not lead you to ask, oh, but how many eyelashes does it have, or what color is it? It leads you to behave differently. So changes of behavior, note, are what's called for here. The reason, and I'll come on to this in a minute, but the reason that I've picked the famous example of Abraham's sacrificing of Isaac is that's precisely that expressed in a nutshell. One of the most uncomfortable stories of the Bible, the one that Kierkegaard therefore picks up, because Kierkegaard is this wonderful philosopher who does not shy away from difficult problems, which is why I would argue that he's quintessentially religious, because he takes on the very hardest struggles of understanding the world. And he says, that is possible. This is something that can happen. I don't care whether you think it really happened or not. It's something that can happen. What is it to do this sort of thing? And he calls it the teleological suspension of the ethical. What he means by that is you can be commanded to do what you know to be wrong. So think like this, however strange it may strike you, or won't you do this, however repugnant you find it. And all of this is bound up with a comment I made before about The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, where Wittgenstein said, if it's seen as this beautiful story of someone going through travails, going through obstacles and challenges and difficulties and overcoming them in order to get to Christendom, then it's beautiful. If, however, you see it as God getting in his way to try and stop him from getting to Christendom, just as a test to see if he can, then it's horrible, because it's kind of like you have to justify yourself by doing this. Then it becomes this kind of awful story of someone who has power over him. A little bit like the Rush Reese example of God saying, do this or I'll blast you. And then, of course, Rush Reese saying, I need to now have the decency to say, go ahead and blast. I need to have that decency, because the decency isn't in following that command. But if you just followed this, if you were just told, do this, there's no justification for it, and nor will you get one from me. That's different. And again, remember the book of Job. Job gets before God and gets to ask these questions. Consolers have tried to console Job, but what consoles him in the end? He asks God, why did this happen? And he gives him no justification, no explanation, because if he was to offer a reason for doing this to Job, there would be an easy counter reason. But why didn't you do it to someone else? Or why did you not make it slightly less horrible for me? Or why did you even need to see that happen? It becomes an uglier story. But it can be a beautiful story if it is something, Job goes through these awful circumstances, meets God, and God gives him nothing in return, gives him no rational justification, no providential account, just there isn't any providence. What did you think that the sheep you were sacrificing had providence on their side? Did you think that any of this stuff that was happening to you had any justification or reason for it? It's the world. That's what it is. I can show you a mirror, and that's all I can show you. So there is something profound about this idea of taking a kind of what I would call a non-apologetic route. There's no need to justify evils. There's no need to explain evils, because the whole point of religion is to say, react to evils like this, react to goods like this, react to the world like this. Simone Weil, I've mentioned before, had this idea of an equilibrium, where if something good happens, you want to be thanked, and if something bad happens, you want to be compensated, always to try and come back to that equilibrium. She says being a Christian is throwing that away. Because again, it's think like this and don't look for justification, don't look for explanation or for recompense. There's no recompense for existence. So what I would argue here is that we aren't talking about something that's either rational or irrational. We have to get that out of the, because whenever I deliver this, for instance, I said before, we can look for the cause and we can not look for the cause. And what I always hear from scientists is the response, but not looking for the cause is embracing ignorance. And I say, no, not necessarily. What I mean by that is we don't have to be scientists all the time. That can be established straight away. The other thing I said about um, even if science can explain everything, that doesn't mean every explanation has to be scientific. I still hold to that. That even if science could explain everything, I don't have to seek a scientific explanation for it. Because equally, even if religion could explain everything, which presumably it can, doesn't mean I have to look for a religious explanation for everything either. Why is my milk curdled? Oh, I'll look for a religious explanation. Why would I do that? Why not look for a scientific explanation in that situation? But why not just look for no explanation? So the analogy that perhaps is closer to it is I can walk from here to a town nearby, and I can decide to stop halfway and just not walk. And that's what I mean by not looking for the cause. If I'm looking for the cause, great, but I can also just not look for the cause, just stop walking. I can just not do the action. It's not the reverse of it. It's not deliberately avoiding the explanation, because that would mean to have the thought, should I look for the cause, and then decide not to. It just means I don't have to. I don't have to go looking for the cause. So we can think rationally, we can think irrationally, but we can also think what I would call non-rationally, which is to say, without either being rational or irrational. There are some behaviors that are just behaviors. Waving good morning is neither rational nor irrational. It's just non-rational. Sitting facing you all. If I was in a classroom with you all now, sitting facing you, that would be perfectly natural. If I turned away and had my back to you, that might be natural in some other class or in a confession or in some other circumstance in which it's better if we don't have eye contact. But when we say better, what do we mean by better? It's just, oh, it's not done. We don't do that. We don't look at each other. There's no reason why a confessional has to have a separate space, that sort of masks but doesn't fully mask. There's a mesh, right? So there's no reason why that has to be there at all. And you can confess face to face. There's no reason, there's no rule against this. The point is that people just started adopting the practice of sitting in cubicles next to each other and confessing through a wall effectively. But you can confess to any priest, but you can't confess to anyone. I mean, you can confess to anyone. You can't religiously confess to anyone, depending on the religion. So the point here is that what determines the rules of that particular game are not another set of rules that are open to scrutiny. And it's a mistake to think that they are. So the point I was making about the teleological suspension of the ethical is this, that it tells you do this. It does not offer a justification, but neither does so much of what we do in life. We don't have a justification for looking for the cause. Scientists don't have a justification for looking to evidence. That's what you do when you're a scientist. You can keep asking why, but at some point they're going to say, we just do. And that's what you have to accept. Whereas religion draws that line and says, this is where the thing starts. Do this here. Start with this. But this might make it sound like I'm being critical. I am absolutely not being critical of religion as a form of life. On the contrary, I think that's a remarkable thing. I think it's wonderful. And again, it's true of so many other things. There's something called Wittgenstein's paradox, which is any set of rules might be governed by another set of rules, which might thereby be governed by another set of rules and another set and another set, but it can't go on forever. So just as explanations have to come to an end, so too does looking for the higher rule that applies. So a referee makes a bad call, so the FA get involved. The FA reinforce the rules, so the press get involved, and then the fans might get angry. And so there's like these levels of complexity, but you can just bring it to an end with the referee, or even just get rid of the referee and play with your friends where there is no referee. So you don't even need the referee as an arbiter of the rules. Everyone knows what's right and wrong and just plays by the rules there. So my point is that you have to draw the limit of this constant ratification of things. You have to bring it to an end at some point. Why not do it with the practices themselves? And essentially religion says that. It stops here. It just stops. Don't keep going. But there is also this wonderful, I mentioned before the famous example of, is something good because God does it, or does God do it because it's good? There is another example of this which comes from Augustine, where Augustine says, do we understand in order to believe, or do we believe in order to understand? And Wittgenstein says the latter, again, is more challenging, and therefore the one that's probably correct. Because if the idea is that we have to understand in order to believe, like I said before, no one could have ever been converted. How could you understand the stories of the Bible if you don't know the places, the people, or anything, or even the language in which it's expressed? How could you possibly be converted to that faith? But you can be converted to that faith, and actuality proves possibility. So if it's possible, then presumably you have to believe first, and then the stories come later. So what does belief look like? Belief is a form of life. It's a way of acting. It's doing certain things, because you can do things without understanding them. Remember my example of the student who laughed at a joke that he didn't understand? He got it. He could laugh. He found it funny, but he didn't understand why it was funny. Only articulating it afterwards could he understand why it was funny. So Wittgenstein does not hold that any particular belief can be placed beyond the need for justification. You can't push it past justification. You can't say, so I have a set of beliefs already, and I'm just going to say you can't ask questions. You can't do that. Well, maybe you could. There's a lovely example where the game I Win, a child playing the game I Win. So a child just says, whatever happens, whatever cards land up on the table, I win. Then you might say, well, but why would anyone play that game? Well, the child's got a very good reason. They win every time. It's great. But for everyone else, it sucks. So I totally understand why that game might not last very long. But the game I Win can be upheld. You can push your justifications beyond and say, oh, no, that's just the case. We just make this true. But ultimately, it has to be a working system. Otherwise, it's just going to fizzle out, a little bit like Spinoza's point that every idea has to justify itself to some extent, because it has to. If I said I'm going to make up a day between Wednesday and Thursday, and you say, what's it called? Flom's Day. And you say, okay, well, how long does it last? It already crumbles under rational scrutiny. So things that can crumble under rational scrutiny. So the point is you can't push them beyond rationality, but some things do exist prior to rationality. Some things determine on what grounds something is rational or irrational. So, and I would also argue that there are, like I said before, there are ritualistic practices and there are superstitious practices. And superstitious practices, precisely because of their pseudoscientific nature or scientific nature, because again, some superstitions have turned out to be true. And again, like I said, not walking under ladders is probably a very sensible thing to do. So it doesn't matter that it's a superstition. It's also just good sense. So the existence of like this pseudoscientific approach means that they are attempts to justify. And where they exist, I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about the things prior to that. So where you are finding a justification, I'm going to keep asking, okay, but what precedes that? And what precedes that? And what Wittgenstein is saying with religion, all you get back to is a set of commands. Once you get back to it far enough, it's just think like this, do this. No matter how you think about it, just do this. Perhaps one really interesting, relevant modern example of this is Mormonism. I know that it's been made fun of a lot by comedians who make fun of what Mormons believe. Often not actually spitefully, but they do actually make fun of the stories that led up to the existence of the Mormon Church. And that's a real shame, I think, because it ignores the fact that what you could be doing is simply the suspension of disbelief, or it could be that the idea is you just believe these stories. That's what that is to do. And by the way, it's also to ignore fundamentally that probably the people who are making fun of the faith are themselves subscribing to a set of stories that they don't realize are open to question too, and probably quite ridiculous. And again, this is something comedians do. Douglas Adams pointed out that who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, he pointed out how absurd it was to even think that everything had a rational justification. And yet we do. We do this all the time. We think that our thinking works this way. I think about all the things I could do, and I arrive at the conclusion, I can go on holiday. Actually, what happens is we decide we're going on holiday, and then we come up with our reasons for why that would be a good idea. That's how reason works. We have our decision, and then we work out why it's a good decision. We don't come up with all our different reasons, and then make a decision, except in some very rare cases. Very occasionally, we weigh up the decision and then make a decision. Most of the time, we've already made our decision, and reason comes in to supply justifications. And that is why Wittgenstein also said, for every good reason you can offer in defense of religion, you can offer a counter argument as well, which is why you shouldn't bother, because it doesn't need it. It never did. Just as reason or science or eating and drinking and any kind of sport, any game that we play, there is no reason for it to exist. It's just there. It exists because the rules are there to exist, and the rules say do this in order to play the game. So it's a particular game, and it is particularly significant as a game, I would argue, but it is ultimately still bound by that same principle, which is where fideism comes into the mix. The example I've given here is do not read this sign. I love that. I've always liked those kinds of strange examples where in order to understand it, you shouldn't read the sign, you have to have read it, and that's part of the problem. So this kind of, is it a paradox? I don't think it is, because again, it can exist on a wall somewhere, on a hedge here. It can just exist somewhere. It doesn't have to actually ever be read. So it's not technically a paradox. Or I suppose you could say creating it was a paradox. But it's not really that. It's just weirdly contradictory. But the point here is, again, what is the justification for that working as a joke? There is none. It's just hilarious because that's it's misunderstanding its own rules, and the nature of misunderstanding rules is there can't be rules for misunderstanding rules. You can't have the rule ignore all the rules. That doesn't make any sense. So that would be paradoxical. And so this idea of trying to avoid, if you try and argue that everything has to be rational, you are going to be led into paradox. You are always going to be led to paradox. And so it's so much more sensible to say what undergirds rationality and irrationality, what gives rise to rationality and irrationality is non-rationality. As I've said before, we're biological first, logical second. That's the nature of human beings. We're biological first, logical second. AI does have problems with paradox. That's why we have all these jokes about robots' heads exploding when you deliver them a paradox. This sentence is a lie. With human beings, we can understand that because we can get beyond it, because we can avoid it, basically. I gave the example as well, I think, of Russell's barber paradox. The barber is the person who shaves all those who do not shave themselves. Does the barber shave themselves? If you answer yes, then you've contradicted yourself. If you answer no, then you've contradicted yourself. So the set of all sets that contain things that are not in a set. You don't need to know any of that. That's deep philosophy. But the point is, Russell created that paradox precisely because he thought that the world was logical. He believed that everything was reducible to logical atoms. If you think the world is logical first, then you are always going to get paradox, because you're always going to be frustrated with this explanation. But why this explanation, not another explanation? But what about the barber paradox? The barber paradox is solved by saying, no, the barber is only a barber when they shave others. When they shave themselves, they're just Ken. Right? So the barber is the person who shaves all those who do not shave themselves when he's a barber. But when he's not, but Russell can't take that way out of that paradox, because that would be to assume that professions exist, that the logical nature follows the practical nature. That establishing himself as a barber brings the rules with it. That establishing himself as Ken brings a different set of rules with him. But Russell has no way out to get out of that, because that's not logic. And so if logic is the ultimate end of all things, if explanations don't come to an end, because the explanation is the end, the logical explanation is the final explanation. If you think that, then you're going to be frustrated all day, every day. And that's what Russell thought was, trivializing philosophy, was to say, just stop doing that and you'll be fine. So I've seen logical disproofs of God. I have my own, by the way. If you're interested, it goes like this. You don't have to believe in possible worlds for this, but it's helpful. The possible worlds are a philosophical tool where you say, imagine there is another world exactly like this one, meaning all the totality of facts, another universe, another complete reality that's similar to this, but different in certain ways. Someone has argued that there are as many possible worlds as there are logical ways of constructing a world. So there is a world that exists where I have a herring on my head and I'm speaking French, because that's logically possible. Therefore, it must exist as a possible world. Now I ask the question, and this is, again, it's purely hypothetical, but it is a proof. Um, is there a possible world that wasn't created by God? If the answer is yes, then we have a problem, because there's that world could be this one, but it could also be just another world with people like us in it, which would be very sad for them. So is there a world, is it possible to have a world that wasn't created by God? If you answer yes, you have a problem. If you answer no, now you've got a bigger problem, because now I have to ask you what logical proof you have that every single possible world had to be created by God. What's the logical proof for this? Because I know there's no possible world in which there is a five-sided square. There's no world in which there is a five-sided square, because the nature of squareness is that it has four sides. So I can prove that. I can't. I'm not. I probably couldn't actually work for a proof of that, but I know that one exists. I could go out and find one. I could probably Google it, but I can find a proof of why a square. And equally, I could probably just argue a square equals a polygon that has four sides. Therefore, there can't be a possible world in which there's a five-sided one. And there can't be a married bachelor either. And there can't be something that is identical to itself but is not itself. So again, there are all sorts of like logical and mathematical and even just analytic conceptual rules, like married bachelors. There are certain conceptual rules that exist that just rule out the existence of certain things. This does not apply, it seems to me, to the existence of God. So you can't come up with a logical proof, absolutely. Or if you could, then we wouldn't even have to debate it. Wouldn't have to. We aren't sitting here debating the existence of squares and having four sides. We don't have to do that. So my point is that seems to completely refute the existence of God, which is probably a good thing, especially if you're religious, because if God exists, then he is trivial, like my heart existing is trivial. The existence of Tuesdays is trivial. It's just a fact like any other. It could exist, it could not exist. This happens to be a world that was created by God. That's just a fact about this world that would be a different fact about another world. So I would argue that's the way to trivialize God, is to talk about existence. This is why Kierkegaard says God does not exist. He is eternal. Because once God becomes eternal, now we don't have these kinds of problems. We don't make him trivial. We don't have to debate his existence in possible worlds. We don't have to say, did he create possible worlds? We can just say, God is. God just is. Like the number eight. Maybe no one has ever thought the number eight or uttered the word eight or even conceptualized of eight in some possible worlds. Doesn't stop it being eternally significant for every possible world anyway. So making God eternal removes that kind of problem anyway, but it also makes it arguably non-rational, because what it's saying is it's just something that's there, like our life. It's not something that comes into existence or goes out of existence. Although again, the existence of this glass is trivial and it is there like our life, but it could equally not exist. It does seem contingent. Whereas other things, the existence of a language game, the possibility of a language game, if it actually exists, then it can definitely possibly exist. Because again, I said actuality proves possibility. So there are all sorts of ways of working this through using logic, but we don't have to. Because the whole point is that we can just say that what we're talking about when we talk about religion is an attitude, not a set of beliefs, not a set of beliefs about what trivially exists or does not exist. But this raises a problem. As we've said, there is a bigger problem that I'm most interested in, which is this question of, are we even talking about religion here? Because it's to make these certain assumptions. So for instance, fidists, like Wittgensteinian fidists, like myself, are often thought to be arguing that religions never attempt to describe the world, right? That we're not talking about beliefs and facts. I've just made it look that way very much, haven't I? I've just said that God does not exist, he is eternal. So we're not talking about describing the world as having extra stuff in it. It also, we're accused of saying that the descriptions that religions give of the world are always correct. Well, that can't be true. One or the other. Basically, we're either not we're either saying that religion doesn't attempt to describe the world, or we're trying to say that whenever religion does describe the world, it must be correct. But what I want to argue is that religion is not primarily about describing the world. You can have descriptions as part of the world within religion. The existence, when they rolled the rock away, was Jesus's body present or was it not? That's a description of the world. Are there such things as angels? Was there such a place as Eden? Am I going to have an afterlife? And so on. These sorts of questions are pertinent questions to have within religion. But the religious form of life that gives those questions meaning and makes them mean something significant. Again, the foundation for that. Remember Simone Weil? I mentioned this previously, that she said, "My faith is not based on a historical anecdote. It's not based on a description of the world." That doesn't mean, however, that she can't also add, but if it didn't happen, then it's all for nothing. If they rolled the rock away and there was just a corpse in there, then that just means Wittgenstein makes that exact point as well, by the way. He says, I can't use the word Lord correctly, but what makes even me, he says, think that Jesus Christ must have been reincarnated reborn and then ascended into heaven. It says, because if he didn't, he just rotted like any other corpse. And it's that my mind rebels at it, he says. The meaning of Jesus Christ refutes the idea that he could have just decomposed. Doesn't make sense. It's an absurdity to even suggest it. But it's only an absurdity because the world has meaning. The form of life in which it is part has meaning. But Wittgenstein said, even I'm a part of that form of life, even though I can't use the word Lord correctly because I don't participate. I observe. And when I observe this form of life, Jesus Christ is just that character. It's like saying, sorry, and this is trivial, I realize it's an awful parallel to use, but Clifford the Big Red Dog. If someone said that Clifford the Big Red Dog is actually quite small and he's blue, I would say you have fundamentally just misunderstood what it means to talk about Clifford the Big Red Dog. Right? I've used that example because even if you're not aware of Clifford the Big Red Dog, guess what? He's a dog, he's big, and he's red. So it's in the concept of Clifford the Big Red Dog that he is big and he is red. It is in the concept of Jesus Christ that he was reborn, he was resurrected, and he ascended. That's just in the concept of Jesus Christ. And you may think that that's a false story, in which case you might just be an observer of those facts. But those are beyond facts. They're an attitude to the world or a form of life which allows for those facts to have meaning. Again, not explaining this in the best way, but my point is it's not about describing the world. Science is also not just about describing the world, because again, it's about taking an attitude to the world that says these descriptions have weight and meaning because they can be provided with evidence. That's an approach, a methodology, as it were. And again, we come back to this question of methodology. Wittgensteinians taking a methodology when it comes to looking at religious forms of life, or indeed any form of life, and saying, what is it that gives rise to it is not the beliefs that come out of it, but the stuff that comes into it, which is an attitude which is itself not justified by any facts before it. So what he's saying is, Wittgenstein is saying that there is a non-rational, not irrational, there's a non-rational status of some beliefs, or what I would prefer to call attitudes. I've slipped there. I have elsewhere changed the word belief to attitude. Wittgenstein makes it clear that what he says is, I don't believe that someone has a soul. My attitude is towards a soul. What he means by that is just, I cannot, if I was to doubt that they had a soul, then it would be, how would I even behave differently around them? How would I even conduct myself around a human being that I thought didn't have a soul? There's an interesting example of something called they're called P zombies because they're philosophical zombies. There's a thought experiment in philosophy called philosophical zombies. And it's the idea that imagine other people don't have the same inner reality that you do. So I'm looking at Aaron here. He's the only person on my screen. So I'm looking at Aaron. And it takes an effort of my part to try and imagine him as you, and I'm probably going to fail, not having an inner life, not experiencing things, but reacting as if he had experiences of things. And again, this is logically possible. We could imagine this theoretically working, that people would behave this way. AI cows exist. They've created cows that are AI. And of course, if you push them, they react. And if you hit them, they react. Horrible. But again, they're not feeling pain. They just react because they know that sensors read this certain behavior and they react. So they don't have an inner life. They're just AI, they're just code. So they're just reacting to what's, mechanically to a behavior, just as if I hit a desk, it would fall over. But that doesn't mean that it's feeling that or reacting in the same way that even the AI cow is, but the AI is not feeling anything. If I throw my Google speaker against the wall, it might make this sputtering sound, but it's not screaming in agony or anything like that. But or even if I scream and then I throw it, um, bad example. Anyway, my point is, you can imagine someone having no inner life, and that's what's called a philosophical zombie. Um, but the effort that it takes to imagine treating someone that way, and I've even asked school children this. I've said to them, imagine the person sitting next to you isn't a real person. Imagine them a piece of furniture, and they all find this impossible. They find it impossible to treat someone as a piece of. That's what Wittgenstein's talking about. An attitude towards a soul is that you sit differently in a room when you're in a room with another person than you would if you didn't have another person in that room. You just behave different. You hold yourself differently. Interesting, actually. That's reminded me of something beautiful. Actually, I've forgotten about this completely until I saw it recently. Wittgenstein said that what's the difference between someone who has religious belief and someone who doesn't have religious belief? They might behave exactly the same way. But he says someone who is suspended from above as if by wires would look exactly the same as someone who is suspended by their own weight holding them up. But they are different. Something that is lifted from above mechanically or held up by something is fundamentally different from something that is suspended by its own inertia, as it were, from within. Yeah, so something that is supported from outside is different from something supported inside, even though it itself is holding exactly the same shape and form. So to be religious is to be held up from inside. It's to be suspended from inside as opposed to being held up from outside. That's just very interesting to me. And again, speaks to this idea of a fundamentally different attitude. You look at someone, it's like, now we're not talking about philosophical zombies, but you imagine now that you look at someone and they all have inner lives, but that one person has an inner life that is religious. They are suspended differently from someone else who is suspended only by their reality that they accord with cause and effect, and so on. Someone who is religious is suspended in a slightly different way. They're supported in a slightly different way. That's what Wittgenstein means is a subtle difference. And again, they might have all shared beliefs, except for where they start to diverge. But those divergences are not the reason for the divergences. They're behaving differently are not the reasons why they're behaving differently. They're behaving differently because their internal suspension, their attitude to the world is subtly different from someone else's attitude to the world. And it's this difference in attitudes that explains the difference between people who are religious and people who are not religious. And again, that's not fideism. That's not saying that one person is correct. It's simply saying that there is an existence of a difference. And it's hard to see and it's hard to articulate. And we too easily and too readily fall upon the words or the theories or the beliefs or the opinions that people hold, because it's very hard to articulate attitudes because they aren't propositional. They aren't sentences. If I had to describe the difference between a religious person and a non-religious person, I just have through omission. I've described it without saying what the difference is because I can't specify that difference. What is it that makes me and Wittgenstein feel like we're cut off from religion? Or other, indeed, many other philosophers feel this way. There's something profoundly beautiful pulling me in this direction. Edmund Burke said, "A little philosophy inclineth man's mind towards atheism. A lot of philosophy inclineth man's mind towards religion." And I feel very much that's the way. When I was 15 and studying philosophy for the first time, I was that village atheist that Cormac McCarthy talks about, endlessly reviling that which I don't even believe in. I laugh at that character now because it is absurd. And there's a lovely line in The Sunset Limited where he used that. Cormac McCarthy has this character who is an atheist, but he says, "I hate the village atheist." And again, we're going to come on to these people next week, but people like Richard Dawkins who endlessly revile that which they don't believe in the first place. I will give Richard Dawkins this benefit. He has what he thinks are good reasons for thinking that religion is a bad idea. He just doesn't know what religion is, though. So he's always going to be wrong about thinking it's a bad idea. or so I would argue, anyway. But again, how much support he would give to this argument, I suspect he wouldn't. You would think he would be happy, right? An atheist, you think, someone like Richard Dawkins, who would say science describes the world, religion fails to describe the world or misdescribes the world. To which I can respond, no, religion doesn't even attempt to describe the world. It starts from a different starting position to you. That's what religion is. You would think he would be pleased by that news because then he could say, "Oh, so we don't have a competitor to science." No, you never did. You never did. Although you did have something that gave rise to it. It's called religion. It did create science, but no, it's not a competitor. Although unfortunately, there are religious people who do think that science is a competitor, and so get into these kinds of debates. There's a wonderful book by Alvin Plantinga. I do recommend it, even though I disagree with it. He is a fantastic philosopher. Alvin Plantinga wrote um, naturalism and evolution, where the conflict really lies. His argument is that you can't be a naturalist, you can't believe that there's nothing supernatural, and also believe in evolution. For a very interesting and complex reason, which we might get into in the final session. I do think Alvin Plantinga is very interesting. But I've inverted that to say where the lies really conflict, because I think science versus religion, it's where the lies really conflict. Because again, I don't think there's any conflict there at all. Anyway, we can go into that another time. But so again, similar point to the ones we've made already. But Wittgenstein says at the foundation of well-founded belief. At the foundation of well-founded belief. These are beliefs that are well-founded. At the foundation of them, though, lies belief that is not founded. So again, this is part of the problem. Wittgenstein uses belief here again, but I think what he means here again is something like attitude. The foundation of well-founded beliefs lies an attitude that is not founded. I think that's really what he's getting at, even in his own terms. But what he's talking about here is, again, really good reasoned beliefs, sets of arguments. Again, if you keep asking why, like a 4-year-old, why, even the professor at Cambridge or Oxford or Harvard or wherever, or the scientist or the priest or the Pope will eventually just say, well, it is because I say it is. And with the Pope, actually, as you all know, it does actually follow that what he says is true because there's papal infallibility. Although, as one comedian put it, the Pope can only tell you which books not to read. He can't tell you which books you should read, which I think is quite an interesting way of looking at infallibility. He can tell you what you shouldn't do, but not what you should do. So again, this idea that explanations have to come to an end somewhere, and we just say at a certain point, it happens. It's just that's what it is. And Wittgenstein uses the example of a river with fast-moving currents at the top, slower moving currents underneath, even slower moving currents below that. And then there's sediment that will move. Sand will move across as the water spreads over it. But then there's hard-moving sediment that is perhaps moved by geological forces. And then there's bedrock that doesn't move. And if you think of fashion as fast moving, tastes in music and or the latest apps or whatever it might be, then perhaps something like maybe the existence of fashion itself is slower moving. And then the idea of shame and covering one's body is slow moving, or maybe that's sediment, I don't know. And then again, coming down to this hardware, there are some things that are just intractable, that just do not change. You will not find someone who doesn't look for the cause. You will not find someone who doesn't, if Jordan Peterson is right, pray or open themselves up to something higher than themselves. There are no people that don't say in their desperation, help me. Who are they speaking to? So again, this kind of these hard and fast aspects of our behaviors and our natures. There are just so this is similar to a point that Pierre Strawson makes about we can exploit our natures. We can come up with hacks that make us more productive, that make us cleverer, or focus us on things that are useful for the economy as opposed to things that wouldn't be as useful, that can focus us on much needed skills. For instance, I do creativity work, right? So I'm trying to make people more creative. Why is that so important right now? Well, because we have AI, and what's human is creativity, and so we want to see more human beings being creative because AI can't do that yet. So we can move with the times, is my point. And what the ability to move with the times comes with these other more basic things. So we can exploit our natures, but we can't exploit them all the way down. There has to come to a point where, for instance, even just exploiting your nature is itself expressing your nature. There is just an aspect of your nature which is just pure and just expressive. That's what we're talking about with these forms of life. That's what we're talking about with these attitudes. So these foundationalist attitudes are distinct from beliefs because they don't have any reasonableness. Why? Because they determine what counts as reasonable. Depending on your attitude, some things will be reasonable and unreasonable, and if you have a different attitude, different things will be reasonable and unreasonable. And this is for everyone. So it cannot be that we're making this claim for specific attitudes. It can't be that we're accused of fideism because we're saying that specific attitudes get special treatment, get preserved in a special way. Because I'm not saying the unmoving bit is only religion. I'm saying looking for the cause is also an unmoving aspect of ourselves. We were always going to be thinking along scientific lines at a certain level. There are some things, the existence of certain sciences, geology, biology, chemistry, they didn't have to exist because they were things that were slower moving and they were less certain. But the existence of working out what the world is like, that was unmoving. If those of you familiar with philosophy might link this or connect this with what Kant called the categories. Kant had this idea that we just can't help but experience the world in space and time and agency and ethically and all those sorts of things. A tree experiences the world fundamentally different from us. Why? Because we have different sensory organs, but also because we have agency. A tree doesn't have agency. If you imagined a tree with eyes, it could perfectly well understand something unrotting, rolling along the ground, flying up onto its branch, and then turning back into blossom and then vanishing. You could imagine that a tree could just see a process like that in reverse and it would have no issue. A human being can't make sense of this. I can't deliver a sentence backwards because the start of the sentence is the start of the sentence. It can't be the end of the sentence. You can play me backwards, but that's just saying, oh, we're just having the end first and the start last, but it's still the start. You can't change the fact that it's the start. To invert a sentence completely would be for me to know that I'm going to deliver something at the end after I've started the finish. And to have the effect after happen before the cause, that I can't make sense of. So we are also pointing in one direction when it comes to time. We can't help but see things like that. So again, these are very, very basic things about our experience of the world that just defy any appeal to, oh well, but there are better ways of doing it, or there's the correct way of doing it. No, because correctness is determined by this. So let me briefly talk about the diagram on the right. So this is the idea that when we're talking about questions like the nature of the soul or the existence of heaven or the existence of God and all these kinds of things, what we're doing is there's this kind of intersection between religious discussions and metaphysical discussions. I know that some of you are doing the metaphysics course. I thought I'd mention this, but the idea that metaphysics is better suited to science is the argument that the people who accuse us of fideism want to make. They want to replace it with something more like this, where we can have science and metaphysics intersecting. I want to argue that you can have both. You could equally well talk about this in both respects without any kind of conflict or overlap. In fact, maybe I should have put a third circle at the top, slightly overlapping, and that's what religion becomes. So it's just they are intersecting over the metaphysics question, but they don't overlap, they don't conflict. There's no part of science that is religion, and there's no parts of religion that are science. They are separate, but where they might intersect is over questions of metaphysics. And those can be looked at from a scientific perspective, or they can be looked at from a religious perspective. One very powerful example of this, just simply because the person who came up with that tree example I just used was a guy called Michael Dummett. And I found out only after teaching him for a couple of years that Michael Dummett was a spiritualist, as were many philosophers in Cambridge at the turn of from the 19th to the 20th century. Lots of philosophers were spiritualists. Henry Sidgwick and C.D. Broad and Henry Bergson. Lots of these people were thinking along these lines. And what disappoints me about that is you can start to see it's the sort of beginnings of trying to treat religious belief in souls and uh, extrasensory perception and all those sorts of questions. It's starting to treat it as a scientific metaphysics rather than a religious metaphysics. It's a removal from divinity school discussions to a kind of parapsychology level of discussion. And again, both can exist. And I think spiritualism is interesting. I'm a big fan of Henry Bergson. And Henry Bergson was the president of the Psychical Society, which is still going. Um, but I still would argue that they're after fundamentally different things. Understanding what telekinesis is a fundamentally different question to asking questions about the sacraments or about liturgy or about Eucharistic nature of poems and parables and the significance that you might take from the parable of Nathan and David, which we looked at last time, or the story of Abraham and Isaac. These are just fundamentally different kinds of things. They can't possibly intersect in any meaningful way. So, do I think that Wittgenstein is a fideist? Yes, I do. But only if we take that to mean that he does not think a religious form of life requires justification. But he would equally say the same thing about science. And he would equally say the same thing about talking, conversation, jumping, sport, blowing bubbles. They justify themselves. They're acts which are self-justificatory, similar to the point about prayer, that we don't pray necessarily. Some people pray in order for something to happen, but you can see prayer as self-fulfillment, i.e., God will answer all prayers and in the order in which they're given, precisely because when I pray, I am fulfilling that prayer. I am expressing grief that the world is the way it is. I'm expressing hope that things change. I'm expressing all sorts of things through prayer. That isn't happening in science. And it's not what. Here's a really lovely example. I had a student who was Chinese, and she'd just come back from Tibet. And she said, Qi is an energy. She said, Qi is an energy. And I said, oh, okay. How do you measure it? I assume you're using the word energy in the same way that a physicist would use the word energy. So how do you measure this energy? Oh, you can't. Then how do you know it's an energy? We only have the concept of kinetic energy or potential energy or um, kilojoules and all these sorts of, we only understand energy in terms of measurement. So what's the measurement? Oh, there isn't one. Then can I suggest to you that the word energy here is a metaphor? That what you're really expressing is the idea that there is a shared link between all of us. There is an energy to a set of people who have those shared beliefs. We can express ourselves more meaningfully as a collective. Um, One example of this would be if Wittgenstein is right and language is public first and private second, then there is a shared consciousness. There's a reason why Charles Darwin and Wallace both came up with the theory of natural selection at the same time. There's a reason that Leibniz and Newton came up with calculus at exactly the same time. So much so that Leibniz was accused of plagiarizing Newton. We now know that's not true. They just happened to come up with the same idea at the same time. That the idea that ideas would occur at a particular time makes perfect sense. You can't come up with the energy saving light bulb before the light bulb. There's just an ordering to these things that they must come about in a particular time and place. So if that's possible, then there's this kind of shared understanding, this shared consciousness. That's key to many Buddhist principles, and I can prove that that exists. So why does it help to then say, oh no, it's a psychic energy that we share? Who cares? What significance can you attach to that? If magnetism didn't exist, would it change fundamentally how you feel about the meaning of the world? It's just a fact. It's just the existence of it. It's like whether you have sugar in your tea, whether you have magnetism in a magnet. These forces that exist don't add meaning to our lives. They just exist. They're just stuff. So the idea that chi was energy to me made me think, oh, it's totally unremarkable then, because magnetism is energy. So what? Does that change it? Would you worship magnetism? Would you think that your life should be ordered around the meaning that you can take from magnetism? Should we always turn to the north? or the magnetic north, I should say, which is about to switch. We're waiting for that to happen, right? We're waiting for the north to become south. Magnetic, yeah, it's going to throw GPS out, and we don't know what's going to happen. It's like the next Y2K problem. Hopefully, it's just as problematic, which is to say, it wasn't. Um, so, again, speaking of problems, is it a problem that we're fideistic? I would argue no, if we can also apply this to every other form of life. So, as long as we can say that what Wittgenstein is talking about here is a method for understanding all forms of life and not equally weighing them, because again, that would be to suggest they're equally meaningful, would be to suggest that there is a sort of arch form of life that gives things meaning and accords them, oh, you have the right to exist. No, they just exist. They don't have a right to exist. They don't have a justification for existing. They don't have a reason for existing. They just exist. And with that existence comes meaning and justification and reason. It comes only after. They're a precursor to asking that kind of question. So, oh, yeah, go ahead, Aaron. Yeah, please.
Yes, sorry to interrupt. I've just noticed we've had some people drop off over the last couple of minutes, and it may be worth checking to see if they're looking to get back into the room.
Oh, good. Um, no, I haven't, but I have had a couple of no, okay. No, interesting. Okay. No, nothing yet, Aaron. I can't see anyone trying to join, but thank you
Okay, very
very
good.
much for suggesting it. But no, we'll go back to the call. So very near the end now, and perhaps we'll finish a bit early, but we'll give everyone who's still here a chance to ask questions. So yeah, so perhaps there's this other problem, which is that Wittgenstein might well appear to be saying that any form of life is just fine. But again, as I just said, that would be to imply through just fine that there's a justification. Rather, it's to say every form of life is not just fine, just is. So I would argue that Wittgenstein is ruling out anyone defending their form of life, therefore, as righteous or best, and that might give us pause. We might now say, okay, but my religion is the one true way. It is the way and the light and the truth. How can you offer then this same justification, which is not? How can you say that that is unjustified in the same way that Hinduism is unjustified, or Aboriginal beliefs in Australia are unjustified, but exist? Does it mean that everything becomes neutral? Basically, does it mean that we're not offering justifications, but we're just saying all beliefs have equal significance because they equally exist? Um, and there is this further problem that what Wittgenstein is seeming to do is offering a defense of a particular attitude as religious that is non-apologetic. Well, what about apologetic religions then? It's not providential. Well, what about religions that are providential then? It's offering a finite view of life, meaning Wittgenstein asks at one point, what answers come from having more life? Why would more of this help me? So again, he's making the point that our life should be viewed eternally, not as internally and eternally significant, meaning it has a beginning, it has an end, and because of that, it has eternal significance. Each part of that life then fits together as a meaningful narrative. That's what the eternal significance is. That is what it is to view your life sub specie eternitatis, or as Nietzsche says, viewing your life as a work of art. To see your life as a work of art, to see it from the outside, to see it as a complete whole, requires that it not be getting more later, because otherwise, everything you're doing now is traded off till later, but also, what's the significance of later? If it is more of the same, then I can't ever find that meaning. And if it's not more of the same, I become some sort of energy like chi, then how is that actually the continuation of life? So either I don't exist or I do exist. If I do exist, then I must exist as I currently do. And that would be kind of just more again of the same. It would just be more triviality. It wouldn't provide meaning. It can't be, as Wittgenstein says, meaning has to be found outside of space and time. It can't be found in a shop locally. You can't, pop along and get, half a dozen eggs and also some meaning for your life. So but I think what Wittgenstein would say here, and again, you might find this a very weak response, is simply to say, asking the question, is my life, is this form of life the right one? Is it a good form of life? Is just a mistake. It's just the wrong way to be thinking about your life fundamentally, or rather, It's a question you cannot ask because you're asking it from within that life. So it's to say meaning can be attached to things from within your life, but your life itself cannot be given meaning from something completely outside, which is seemingly contradictory to what I just said. But my point is, it can't be given meaning by a specific thing outside of one's life. It can be given meaning by stepping out and viewing one's life sub specie aeternitatis. It has to be seen as a whole. It can't be that one thing specifically out here is then going to be contributing to the meaning of this life here. Again, this seems to fall flat with many people. Most of my students, for instance, when I teach, I think I've mentioned this, but when I teach by different conceptions of the afterlife course, where I say more life or eternal life, which one's more meaningful? And they go, oh, eternal life. And I say, which one do you want? Oh, more life. Okay. And then they say, can't we have both? And I say, no, because they go in those directions. You can't have both. It doesn't make sense to have both. But again, to ask questions like, here's an interesting way of looking at it, actually. And DZ Phillips wrote an entire book on this with his predecessor as professor at Swansea, who was a guy called Ilham Dillman. Wonderful name. Ilhamdilman. Ilham Dillman. Wonderful name. They wrote a book about self-deception. In particular, they were very interested in this idea of being a born-again Christian. When you're a born-again Christian, are you born again because you realize that your past life wasn't really worth living at all? Or are you a born again Christian because you believe that back then I really did want those things, and now I realize that they aren't worth having? The point is, did I not really ever want to be that person, but now I really want to be this person? And that sort of kind of confirms it for me. I never really wanted to be. Classic example is Ivan Illich from Tolstoy's The Death of Ivan Illich. Ivan is told he has 2 weeks to live. He reassesses his life. He's like, oh, I never really wanted to do that. It was all about money and women and power and all these sorts of things and trivialities. I should have been at here with my family. I should have been living a meaningful life with them, with love, and with me, and treating people with respect and all these kinds of things. So he reassesses his life. And does he realize at that point that all those things he did before weren't really things that he wanted? Or does he realize that he did want them, but now they were never really worth having? And I don't, again, it feels like one of those debates in philosophy. It's like they're just arguing over a tiny little smidge of information. But it feels like it becomes important with this question, because if you can say that my life was meaningful before and now it's meaningful in a different way, then you could be saying something like, what affords them meaning is one thing, or maybe different things are affording it meaning at different times. If, however, you think that my life, I never really wanted those things, then it's much harder to say that it's being afforded meaning from outside, or from what Wittgenstein's calling viewing one's life sub specie aeternitatis. It's not viewing your life as a whole. It's viewing your life as, I played badminton for a while, gave up, didn't like it, and then started playing rugby, and I really loved it. That's what it feels like. It feels like they're two separate games. That it's like talking about Wittgenstein as the early and later. It's like separating their lives completely. This one man's life into two pieces and seeing them as separate. Just seems wrong to me. That they are united. That it is the same person. It's precisely because of the things that he did before that he became this thing afterwards. That's what it is to view your life holistically. And so it's to realize I really did want those things before, and now I really realize that I shouldn't have wanted those things, and I want new things. That's DZ Phillips's position, and I lean towards that myself. And I don't think it's just out of loyalty to the man, but also more just this religious idea. And I wonder if Ilham Dillman was coming at it from a more kind of scientific point of view, a kind of more neutral, nihilistic point of view of wants are just wants. They're just these physical desires. And I don't know. Anyway, but that just came to my mind, that there's this question of what gives your life meaning at different stages of your life is a fundamentally different question to what gives your life meaning as a whole. One final thought, and again, leading us into next week, and also I found this poster, which I thought was kind of perfect, given that it's got my name on it, which isn't the Great, by the way, although I am Alexander as well, so it's Carter the Great, whatever. A final thought I had was I often apply this same discussion to discussions of post-truth politics. I've taught a couple of courses on post-truth politics, and this question of explanations coming to an end, and this idea of saying, just do this, think like this, and you can't ask for justification. That seems to be sort of underlying a lot of the kind of ideological approaches people take in politics today. But I've actually said that there's a difference between that and what Wittgenstein's describing. Because when people say something like, you can't ask for my reasons, this is just something I wholly believe in. These are my feelings. I feel this way and you can't question it. When people make that claim, there are reasons why they feel that way. So, for instance, Newt Gingrich said, feelings are facts too. And in that, he is spot on. Feelings are facts too. Polls prove this. I can poll people and find out, how do you feel? Do you feel safer now or than you were 10 years ago? Or do you feel less safe now than 10 years ago? That's a feeling. They can put a number on it. They can say yes or no. I can get facts, data, information. So feelings are facts, but feelings are also supposed to be responsive to facts, meaning if you are actually safer, you should ideally feel safer. If you are actually safer statistically, which are also facts, by the way, and if you're appealing to facts, you should probably appeal to all facts. If you are actually safer at that time, which they were at that time, crime had gone down at the time at which Newt Gingrich was saying this. Under Obama, this was. If that's true, that crime has gone down, violent crime in particular has gone down, and people are actually safer, then they should feel safer. But he said, no, feelings are facts too, meaning don't look any further than that. Don't look for a justification. Don't try to explain it. It's just a fact that people feel this way. And again, people feel the election was stolen, even if it wasn't necessarily, but they feel that way. 40% of people feel that way. Don't question them because there's 40 something percent of the electorate that feel this way. Again, I'm not questioning them on that. What I'm saying is that move to say you can't question it is cynical. It's an attempt to levitate, hence the poster. It's an attempt to say, don't look underneath here. There's nothing, there's nothing to be found underneath this. But there is. It's a magic trick. There is absolutely something supporting it. Namely, I want my guy to win. I want to win the election, and I want that experience to be the one that champions, the one that wins out over the other. There's absolutely a justification for the claims they're making. Someone who sincerely says, I'm religious, I feel this way, or I have this attitude to the world. That, again, is where I stand, and that's a hill I will fight and die on to defend the idea that someone can have an attitude to the world that is separable or even a precursor to all of their other beliefs. But what you can't do is say, I'm going to draw the line here. Please don't look beyond this point. Like that sign, private sign, you can't read beyond this point. Don't read this sign. That is kind of it's a false message. It's to say there isn't a justification for this, but there is a justification for this. You're lying. You're pretending to bring explanations to an end, but there is an explanation for why you're ending it. And if there's an explanation for why you're ending it, then there's an explanation, isn't there? Really complicated, really messy way of thinking, but it is just post-truth politics, I think, has the same kind of feel to me to this. But what separates post-truth politics from religion is that religion is a non-cynical, honest way of expressing an attitude to the world. Post-truth politics is a dishonest, cynical way of expressing an attitude to the world, where you say, I have a belief that gives rise to an attitude, and I'm going to say that attitude is not based on the belief. Well, that's just not true. Okay, that's me. I realize that we've lost a few people. Again, I hope not because of connection reasons. Um, I've had my hand up the whole time, haven't I? But hopefully that worked and we got the recording anyway. So if people want to watch it afterwards, they can. But Aaron, since you're the only one remaining, do you have any questions?
I really found that river analogy to be extremely helpful.
Good.
Um, and so I'm trying to so I think what I'm hearing being expressed here is Wittgenstein is a fideist insofar as he thinks that there are certain attitudes that characterize religious belief that do not have any There's nothing underneath them. That's as far as you can go. And you can't criticize that they just are there at the bottom. So in that sense, he's fideistic. But at the same time, there are other attitudes that we have, such as our attitudes toward causation, that undergird science. And you can't get underneath those ones either. And you can't just so in one sense, he is fideistic toward religion. But if you want to characterize that as fideistic, then he's just fideistic about almost every discipline. And he's going to say, uh, you're a fideist toward science. Like you want to level the objection that I'm fideistic toward religion. I'm going to say you're fideistic toward science and every other discipline. Is that, am I on the right track?
Largely correct, but of course, what Wittgenstein will probably say about others is they're not fideistic about science, because again, that would be fine too. They might be, by the way, but many people don't act that way. So, for instance, I had a scientific colleague who I said, "Well, you can't be a realist," and he goes, "What do you mean? I have to be a realist. I'm a scientist." And I said, "No, no, no, you can't be a realist because you're a scientist. How can you find evidence that your evidence is real?" And he later came to me and went, "You're absolutely right. Science is an epistemology, not an ontology," which was a perfect way of putting it. And I should have put it that way. And he shamed me with how well he could do philosophy, even though he'd never done philosophy before, because it was this perfect response that, you expect from a Cambridge professor, I guess, in any field. But it was so nice to get it sort of crisply put to me that way. But that was the point at which he stopped being fadistic about, or rather, sorry, that was the point at which he stopped thinking that there was an undergirding justification for science being correct. Some people will think, oh, once I've found a verification, that makes it correct. No, no, that makes it verified. It's as simple as that. Again, it's this kind of triviality. It doesn't go beyond the fact itself. You can't say something is verified, therefore it's true. Everything in science as well is true until it's not. And that's what it means to say true to science, is to recognize that things can stay true until they're not. So it's to be open to the possibility of change. So, so I, I'm explaining. So you're absolutely right. So that Wittgenstein is saying, I'm a fideist about every form of life. If it exists as a form of life and there isn't genuinely a justification for its existence before it, then we've reached rock bottom. We've reached the bedrock, and we know that game of that particular language game that's being played just has no other reason for it being played. Um, and the game of giving and asking for reasons can be done within the game all the way down to this point, and then it can't go any further. But there are some people who would deny that claim, because they would say, oh, no, once you've, like Russell, once you've explained it, once you've found the final explanation, that's why explanations have come to an end, because I've explained it away. And I think this is the difference between explaining and explaining away. And I think many scientists think that once they've explained something scientifically, they've explained it away. And that means that they're fideistic about science, but not about anything else. So they're not true feidists. They're not feidists in the way that Wittgenstein is. They're not adopting the broader viewpoint. They're kind of saying, we're right because when we're right, we're always right. Dawkins. Right. Which is ironic, because it's the one thing that he seems to not understand about religion, that it can be an absolute, that this is absolutely correct within the form of life in which it's found. It's an absolute because it's a point that can't be made relativistic. Whereas in science, everything should be relativistic, but the existence of that relativistic nature is itself this fadistic absolute. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
some things have this kind of starting point and then expand out. Science is this kind of contained set of constantly moving, malleable pieces, but that whole the methodology itself is what you have to stay true to as the absolute. You can't change the methodology of science and still have science. Likewise, with religion, I would say you can't change the practices within religion. The woman who says, why shouldn't the Virgin Mary weep for the sins of the world, but would have nothing to say about the Statue of Liberty dancing a polka. That's my sort of example of going to that and saying, whereas science can apply to everything. And this is the sort of insidious nature of science, which again, it's not its weakness, it's its strength. But it is problematic about science that it kind of, oh, I can apply a scientific explanation to anything. Therefore, it must always be absolutely correct when I do so. No, because you can apply it to everything, it's always relative.
Hmm. Yeah. And when you were talking about the two statues last time, and then, bringing them up again this time. I was thinking, because you made a distinction between the scientific, the theological, and the religious. And that I think was helpful to me because both the scientific and the theological are more along like the causation explanation approach. But then the religious can, it's not coextensive with the theological. Um, and then when you were talking about um, oh, what was it? I think it was like, oh, the resurrection, right? You roll away the stone. Is there any body in there? That might be the theological question. But then the religious attitude will determine the meaning that the facts take on. Um, and so the religious attitudes are, I suppose, independent of the facts, because they give the facts meaning. The facts just are, but the religious attitudes are casting them in a certain light, telling us, or not telling us, but um, they just do inform the meaning that we infuse those facts with. So I think I'm seeing that arrow of the relationship between the religious attitudes and the facts that the religion is talking about. Am I getting that direction correct?
You are, but I wonder if maybe, I mean, it's potentially sort there are various ways in which you could take this. One of the ways is to say yes, the attitude it makes you receptive to seeing the facts or pick out certain facts, but even that speaks to a kind of evaluative nature. So it may well be more that what the attitudes give us are a kind of value judgment on the world or a kind of value perspective. Meaning, so what counts as reasonable or unreasonable? Again, that's evaluative. So again, it's not a fact that something is reasonable. We judge it to be reasonable. Why? Because of our attitudes. So the idea, and but notice also the kinds of attitudes that we're talking about. And I think these are often the clue, right? So the attitude towards a soul, which is not based on believing that you have a soul. Like I believe you have a hand, right? That's not how I'm treating my attitude towards a soul. So how many souls were aboard? They didn't ask were they all Christian. They were just, it was just, it's a much more human engagement with people to treat them as a soul, and maybe we then wrap around different facts about what that comes to. But the point nonetheless stands that almost everyone is treating people well, in fact, everyone is treating another person as a human soul. So that one seems quite ubiquitous. But then there's the feeling of perfect safety, which not everyone feels. And again, Wittgenstein thinks perfect safety as well. This isn't providential. This isn't superstitious. This is, I feel perfectly safe, even if terrible things happen to me. And the wonder at the world. Why is there a world at all? Why is there anything at all? That kind of wonder that never goes away, which cannot be removed by giving relativistic answers like, oh well, it's just water vapor refracting in the air at this certain frequency that you're reading as blue. So okay, well, I wondered. I no longer wonder. It's over. But when you wonder and it never goes away, no matter what explanation you're getting, like the Professor Farnsworth Fry situation, right? Why is it this way, not another way? Boom! Right now, suddenly I'm in a completely different sense of wonder. All of the again, that might be considered more ubiquitous. I'm not sure. And again, this is part of the problem is that Wittgenstein seems to be imposing this much. There's still an imposition here of some kind of attitude that's non-providential, non-apologetic. Evil just is, again, wishing tragedy on your friends, this kind of artful way of viewing life sub specie aeternitatis, viewing your life as a whole and complete without having to have an afterlife attached to it. That doesn't, immortality doesn't ensure meaning, whereas viewing one's life eternally does promise meaning. Those sorts of things, these feel true, and they feel resonant, and they feel meaningful and powerful, but I don't necessarily see them all the time when I'm hearing people talk about their faith. And so I just want, is there this kind of ill fit here? So it feels like maybe these are philosophical attitudes, which would be deeply problematic for Wittgenstein, because essentially he would then be criticizing religion, because he would be saying, essentially, I'm going to bundle you in with superstitious belief. belief in crossing oneself is just your crossing of the fingers, unless it's charged with something deeper than that. And again, Wittgenstein did have this real reverence for that depth and the the struggle that is part of religion, right? The one thing I will say about the philosophical perspective that doesn't capture what Wittgenstein is talking about, and actually I'm only realizing this now, so thank you, Aaron, is how much of a struggle he keeps, understanding not preceding belief, but believing in order to understand. That's the harder one. Believing that something is not good, and therefore God does it, but rather God does it and therefore it's good. These are hard things to accept. And Wittgenstein, clearly most philosophers are not willing to commit in that way. Even Wittgenstein struggled to commit in that way, but religious people commit in that way. And I think that's what he's appealing to. Similar to the way in which I can understand what G.K. Chesterton means when he says Job is consoled by God giving him riddles. The riddles of God are more satisfying than the solutions of man. I understand that consolation. I just don't feel it. I'm not consoled, but I can understand why someone would be consoled. Again, that's a concrete, substantive point. Some people are consoled. Some people feel perfectly safe. I don't feel perfectly safe. So yeah, so there's something here that I think is, what's the word? It has shape and form that isn't just this kind of philosophical imposition of a particular perspective, subspecie aeternitatis. There's something more to it than that. It has grammar, and like the statues thing again, I can appeal to that as an example because again, if it was a philosophical perspective, wouldn't it apply to the Statue of Liberty just as easily as it would apply to some Palestinian mother?
Yeah. Yeah, man, that's I feel like I grasp some of it at some times and then it slips away. That's I don't know. I wonder if Wittgenstein has recognized some components of religion um, and maybe sequestered it from the other parts and said, this is true religion. This other stuff is not. And maybe Wittgenstein is right insofar as that's religion for him, but maybe not as it is for most other people. I'm not sure.
And that worries me a lot. So I start to feel like, bro, because I feel like I'm a defender of religion. It's like, but am I, or am I offering a philosophical justification for a particular kind of religion? In which case, now I am a priest, and I said I wasn't preaching, and it now looks like I am. And Wittgenstein did have disciples, so there is this sense maybe that's what they saw in him. Maybe that's yeah. But love the conversation. Thanks, Aaron. We'll end there, but I will see you next week. I hope. It may
Yes,
just be you again. I'm not sure. Hopefully, we'll see others come back. If anyone's watching this online, the recording later, come along, come to the live sessions, please.
very good. Well, thank you very much. I
Brilliant.
appreciate your time.
Thanks, Aaron. Take care. All the best.
Bye.